I'm very excited to introduce our next panel called Mediating Bad Bunny. This panel is going to be moderated by Jillian Baez, who is Associate Professor of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College.
Our theme this afternoon is Mediating Bad Bunny. I'm very excited that we are going to have a conversation with journalists and writers to think about the way in which people are thinking about Bad Bunny, especially outside of academic spaces, and what Bad Bunny is, how he is circulating and what it means within the larger music industries and other media industries as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. My first panelist is Catalina Exliston. Please come up. Preferred pronoun, she, her. Catalina Gata Exliston is an internationally renowned music historian / critic, artist, and culture expert, recognized for her efforts in bridging the gaps between academia, the Latin music industry, and the public through her critically acclaimed platform, Reggaeton con la Gata. RXG is the first bilingual platform dedicated to the intersectional analysis, musicology, and history of reggaeton music. Her podcast, Perreo 101, is the first bilingual podcast in English and Spanish ever, and is regularly featured in colleges worldwide. Her niche curations help shape the landscape of high-profile reggaeton-related projects, such as Neon by Netflix, De La Calle by Paramount Studios, Spotify Studios plus Futuro Studios, Loud, the History of Reggaeton, and high-profile publications such as Time, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, LA Times, NY Times Popcast, and many more. Our second panelist, Susie Exposito, please come up to the stage. Susie uses she, her pronouns. Susie Exposito is a writer, illustrator, and retired punk singer, born to Cuban and Belizean parents. She grew up in Florida and graduated with a BA in writing and minor in gender studies from the New School here in New York City. Before landing at the LA Times as a music reporter and columnist, she became the first Latina to write a cover story for the legendary rock magazine Rolling Stone, examining the rise of reggaeton superstar Bad Bunny. She was also the founding editor of Rolling Stone's first Latin music section, through which she significantly expanded the legendary magazine's coverage of Spanish and Portuguese language music. You can also read her work in Vogue, Pitchfork, and Revolver. Our third panelist is Nina Vasquez. Please come up. Nina uses she, her pronouns. Nina Vasquez is a Puerto Rican history curriculum writer for the Connecticut Historical Society and Wesleyan University's Upward Bound coordinator. With over 5 years of experience working with high school students and college accessibility, Nina is passionate about promoting education and diversity. She holds a dual bachelor's degree in criminal justice and political science from the University of Hartford and a master's degree in Puerto Rican, Caribbean, and Latin American studies from the University of Connecticut. Nina is the recipient of the 2022 STEM Educator Award from CG Inc. and the Community Organizing Award from the City of New Haven, Connecticut. Additionally, Nina is the education chair for Puerto Rico's first reggaeton archive called Hasta Abajo Project and has written for Remezcla and Amazon Music. She has also collaborated with artists like Raul Now and Elvis Crespo. In her free time, Nina enjoys going to museums, trying new foods once a week, and listening to Nas. Welcome, all.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. I know the time is limited. I'll jump right into it. What can I say, or what is there to say about Bad Bunny? He's a phenomenon. He's an incredible entertainer. One of the best artists of the generation, in my opinion. However, our culture, Latino culture, whether it's US or Latin America at large, from Argentina to Mexico and the Caribbean, 500 years or so after the first Africans were kidnapped, trafficked, tortured, freed themselves, and put under a barbaric caste system and mestizaje, we're still dealing with the after effects of colonization today. Wouldn't you say that's fair? Yes?
Yes.
It is no secret I'm one of Bad Bunny's biggest critics. And I'm also one of his biggest fans, I promise. I critique those I love. If I don't care, I don't say anything. So, with that said, I would just like to highlight really quick an article that I wrote for Mezcla 3 years ago. It's an op-ed that's titled "Why Urbano Artists' Scarce Comments on the Black Lives Matter Movement Are a Problem." I was inspired to write this op-ed off of the heels of a collective feeling, not just that I was feeling, but of other Black journalists in the Latin media, because as the world was literally rallying around in solidarity based off of the death of George Floyd, as we all tragically, are aware of, reggaetoneros were doing nothing. There were literal protests in Miami, which is now the hub of reggaeton in the industry. Reggaetoneros were posting their new music videos. They were on the beach posting girls in bikinis. Like, it was as if they were completely unaware of what was going on. So in which case, I invite you to read this article if you haven't before. But what I would like to highlight is that it was no surprise to me that in 2020, a grand majority of these artists were business as usual when Black Lives Matter protests occurred. By this time, the 2020s, white supremacy has seeped through the core of reggaeton, so much to the point that until its history was democratized in popular culture, did a whopping couple of billions in streams and et cetera for people to learn the Black roots of this music. Did anybody even care to go into their own, for their own accord to learn the real roots of this music? Because the industry has an agenda to go ahead and tokenize Blackness and to minimize it. So to have a phenomenon like Bad Bunny to rise while appearing against every social trope there is, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, machismo, except Blackness in this case, I thought that was on brand. I felt disappointed, but not surprised, because Latinidad never centers negritude. It hides it, it runs away from it, it tokenizes it, and it erases it, and erasure is violence. In which case, I actually had a fruitful conversation with his team, who approached me and was like, he's on an island, he doesn't know what's going on, no tiene su celular. I'm like, I'm sorry, this is very convenient. I don't know what to do with that. And in which case, when he finally spoke up, he said, none of us can breathe. I brought this up, and I was called a gringa, a Yankee, highlighted for being born in the US, as if that was my choice, as if my parents didn't come here off of the heels of issues pertaining to colonization itself in Panama. I'm not here for funsies. I was rich in my past life. I don't get all that xenophobia. So in which case, I was very happy that he spoke up, but the tune wasn't quite right. When I called it out, when other Black Latinos called it out, we were called all of these names, and I just really want to highlight that because it really speaks to the topic that we're here for today. So, as we know, 3 years later, he went on the record. People finally paid attention because he expanded his point of view a little bit more. I won't go into reading all of it because I know the time is tight. But in which case, everyone was pretty much upset because he made these comments about Tego, about Blackness, about him not understanding Blackness because he's never experienced it. And I think that that's fair. I think that you can only speak from your point of understanding. However, when you have a massive microphone, you have to use it. You have to educate yourself. You have stands. You have to educate your stands, especially if that's what you're making your branding, no? I invite you to read this piece. Twitter. Oh, my God. Bad Bunny's genetics have been a major point of conversation. I literally just searched Habao and screenshot and saw all these points of views of, that people have. I think from all different angles, people agreeing, people disagreeing, etc. I love Boricuas, but I am not Boricua, so I don't speak on Boricua identity ever. And in which case, I recognize that it's a very complex identity, the term halal, and that's as much as I'll ever say on it, no? My point in even bringing this up is that regardless of what his genetics are, the way that he looks is what allows him into the room, into certain spaces. The industry is not as caribeña as one would think it is. It's very Argentine, it's very Chileno, it's very Colombian. Caribeños somos muy pocos. So al final, people don't care realistically what his genetics are. They care about what he looks like. Because right now, the archetype of what is a reggaetonero, someone very light-skinned or white, and filling a very specific archetype. In which case, I really have to highlight this because going into a bigger scale in regards to mass media, artists like J Balvin is quoted in this article for saying, I didn't think I could do reggaeton, and then I saw Daddy Yankee. Now, I'm not saying Daddy Yankee's white. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying he saw someone who was closer in tonality like him and said, oh my God, I couldn't be inspired by Tego existing because he was so foreign. Pero Cangri is closer in proximity to tonality to me, so now I feel comfortable doing this music. I want you to understand that that's the point of view of this entire industry. In which case, mi gente, estamos en la escuela. I'm very happy to be here. But I do have some things to say in that, it's very exciting where we are, where the culture is going, being able to provide commentary, participate in projects. But I implore you to be careful because at the end of the day, the industry has its agenda. It's a white supremacist agenda. And oftentimes put people like me in positions of, that are powerless. Like I know I'm very popular, I hear. But that doesn't mean I'm a millionaire. That doesn't mean that I'm not surviving. That doesn't mean that I'm still not building myself up monetarily, right? And I'm just one person. We know what the numbers are in regards to Black Latinas. Less than 5% of mainstream reggaetoneras are Black Latinas, right? We know what the numbers are. We know what the lack of representation is. I implore you to say the things that journalists oftentimes can't say because sometimes it's not safe. And I mean that not just for Black journalists, but also white journalists as well. There's a bullying of sorts. There's a lack of integrity of sorts that's occurring in editorial in certain spaces. Academics, I implore you, say the hard things we can't say. Go harder than we can. God, that's going hard. Go harder. In which case, getting to that, we do a lot of work. Sorry, I'm looking at you, Susie. I admire her so much. We do a lot of interviews. What is not seen is the type of violence that I'll speak for me, the type of violence that I experience when we're doing these interviews, the hypersexualization. You didn't see that it hit on me when I was trying to get that interview so I can continue my research, so I can continue to create my platform. You don't see that. You don't see the team hitting on me. I implore, you to recognize the fact that, journalists, we spend hours doing interviews with these artists. They are primary sources. There's a lot that's uncovered that sometimes we don't even feel safe sharing. As it pertains to Bad Bunny, doing these criticisms, it's not easy. The violence that we're met with is profound. There's exclusion, there's lack of monetary access, etc. So be careful because the media coverage, although, it's great, there's a lot of clapping, we also need to be critiquing. I started off this talk by saying, I don't critique things I don't love. I mean that. If I didn't care about Bad Bunny, I wouldn't say a thing. If I didn't care about this culture, I wouldn't say a thing. In which case, Bad Bunny has done many great things. He's opened doors for Dominicans, because as we all know, there's a ton of xenophobia in the industry. El Alfa's been at this 12 years or so. Finally, it wasn't until they made that song, ¿Cuál fue la romana? And that people started saying, oh, he's an artist. This is fun music. We can recognize it as such. Essentially, Dembow is going through now what reggaeton went through 20 years or so in the media in regards to its acceptance. And Bad Bunny was a major aspect of that. I am clapping hard, trust me. In which case, look at the screen. Young Miko, we all saw El Choli, fue bello. Ivy Queen, Viano Antillano, Right Now, El Alfa, Sech. The beautiful display that Bad Bunny did with Residente during the protest of Rosselló. And the beautiful, I think it's beautiful, it's very controversial. The clip that he did for Yo Perreo Sola, I want to just highlight that as we're critiquing, I am clapping. I think this is a quote from my Time magazine article of his cover. I believe that he's a great ambassador and believe that no one artist should be held accountable for the industry's failures around colorism. I stand 10 toes down on that. That's not just on him. In which case, I'm citing a lot of narratives and ideas from Reggaeton versus Reggaeton, Dame Merengueton, Latinidad is a Fairy Tale episodes of my podcast, which is going to be at Tribeca in a month from now. I invite you aquí en la ciudad. Y sí, that's what I have to say about Bad Bunny. In this state, thank you for listening.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susi Exposito. I don't really like these microphones. I definitely prefer these. That I was a retired punk singer because I meant it, and this is a very natural stance for me. So kick back, relax, and I'll tell you how I came to cover this fascinating artist.
All right, so just like a little bit of background, I think that there's like a lot of mythology around who's making the media and like where journalists come from. And so I just want to like clear the air. I'm a fucking weirdo. My parents were like classic Gen X, like they're both, you know, pretty alternative in the 80s. My dad came up going to punk shows here in New York. He's Cuban. My mom immigrated from Belize in the 80s. She moved to Miami. The two of them met in the club and danced to New Order, and that's how you come up with someone like me. So right now, I'm a columnist at the LA Times. We're launching a new Latino initiative section that was, you know, I think my participation in it is very inspired by what I have been able to accomplish in journalism. I think that still in the United States,
especially like mainstream, you know, at all these like legacy publications, there is segregation happening in journalism. It is straight up segregation. And so 10 years ago, I started working as a staff writer, social media person at MTV World, which covered international music. From there, I think it really sparked, like I just had a lot of interest in covering Latin music. And so I think there is when I got like a little bit of room. It was like the least supervised project that MTV ever had. They were like, okay, cover global music for us. I was like, bet, I'm gonna write about a lot of weird Latin music happening. And so I think like early stuff that I wrote about, I wrote about Maluka and like Princess Nokia, a lot of like cool, like hybrid kind of third culture stuff happening, especially like in the U.S., but by a lot of us, you know, who are hybrids, you know, like we're a bunch of third culture Latinas. That's like where my interest was. And so when I started at Rolling Stone, I started working there full time in 2015, and I was the only Latina in the office who was not a receptionist or a janitor. And I say this because I want to stress to you that this is in New York City. I think that you know, at the time it felt super isolating, and I decided that it was going to be my mission to try and like put us on in whatever way I could. But, you know, as Gata alluded to, it also came with a lot of like repercussions, like social repercussions, a lot of exclusion, you know, not being invited to a lot of meetings, not being heard, getting paid, being one of the least paid people in the office. I've talked about that a lot. And so the Bad Bunny cover story, no one handed it to me. I fought for that to happen for like a year and a half. I wanted to have him on the cover back in like 2018. And at that time, it was, you know, I got to write some album reviews about Latin artists. I got to write about all kinds of like just interesting music. And so when Despacito hit, it's just like it was like a flashpoint, you know, at that point in in specifically U.S. music media. And the thing is that Despacito was initially dismissed by a lot of people in music media. They kind of figured it would be like Gangnam Style, where they would, look at what's happened to K-pop. Psy was like the weather vane, I think, for the increasing popularity of K-pop. I think we saw that a long time ago. I think about Gasolina coming out and how huge that was at that point. And the fact that Daddy Yankee came back with Despacito, and made an even bigger splash is profound, but I also think that's the way that our culture is moving. I think that, these generations coming up now are like some of the most curious people. We're curious about the world. We want to see everything. My mom and my dad complain that I travel so much and I don't have any kids yet. But we just want to, we want to try everything. We want to see as much as we can. I think that's like a huge thing that connects millennials and Gen Z, especially. So I think like the Bad Bunny cover, it was something that took a lot of work. In the road leading up to the Bad Bunny cover story, we founded the Latin music section in, I believe, it was 2018. And at that point, I was doing a lot of music reviews, I was doing a lot of news posts, and I was interviewing people for a lot of features, but I think what was so challenging was like constantly having to really push and explain why these artists mattered. Just because they're not Daddy Yankee or Shakira or like J-Lo, it doesn't mean that they don't have something interesting to say. I feel like there's a lot of interesting music happening. And so it was just kind of like a Groundhog Day. Every time we'd have a pitch meeting and I'd be like, this is blowing up. Like reggaeton is having a renaissance right now. I think we should cover it. And it wasn't like, it was just such an uphill battle to get anything in print. About music in Spanish to begin with, I could really go on for like hours, but it was such an uphill battle even to get like Rosalia a feature in print, and she's a super popular Spanish artist who, got a major label deal, but it was still so hard to just put her in the magazine. So I think over time, we were talking about it and they were like, okay, fine. Like, instead of bugging us about putting all these people in print, we'll give you your own section online. And I was like, okay, sounds cool. Do I get a budget? No. And I was like, okay, sounds cool. I guess I'm gonna try and cover over 20 countries worth of music by myself. But you know what? I had a lot of fun. Record scratch, freeze frame. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got here with my cover story on a t-shirt. So I think I realized really early on, it's punk rock to listen to reggaeton. Reggaeton has, I believe a lot of people, almost everybody in here has got to know that reggaeton has a rich history of resistance. When Barrio Fino came out, this is the most mainstream album at that time. But when Barrio Fino came out, the year was 2004. That September, I had my quinceañera in the courtyard of my performing arts high school that was majority white Anglo people. And I brought a boombox and I put it down on the floor. I had on my white confirmation dress and combat boots, but I put down the boombox on the floor and I started playing Daddy Yankee. And I was and my friends were like, what is this? And some people were already into it. There were a lot of white kids at school that loved Gasolina, but it was for them, it was just a passing fad. They were like, oh, this song is so crazy. And I'm just yeah, I fucking love this song. But it's more than that. It's more than just a hype party song. I think for me at that time, it was kind of an affirmation, going to a school like this. I went to high school in Jacksonville, Florida, which is like, I think still has a lot of elements of like the Jim Crow South. In fact, it's escalating now that Governor DeSantis is running a dictatorship in Florida. So at this point, it was like affirming for me to, have this like cultural, I don't know, just something that it felt like it resonated with me. And it was also like this lifeline to my Caribbean heritage, one that had absolutely nothing to do with my parents, their generation, and it didn't advance the goals that they had to like, for me to assimilate in the US as like a good, all-American girl. And so I began writing about music for my high school newspaper, and my mission, I think, from the very beginning, since I was 15 years old, I'm doing the job that I always wanted to do my entire life. And so I think my mission from the very beginning was to boost the culture as much as I could and without getting fired. So just to show you like what we're working with, to speak to Gata's points about how like limited I think news media is right now, and entertainment journalism especially. This is what news organizations in the US are working with today: majority white, non-Hispanic newsrooms, and fewer than 10% of Hispanic journalists, or fewer than 10% of journalists employed to cover entertainment and travel. I don't know why they combined it. Fewer than 10% of entertainment and travel journalists in this study are Hispanic. I mean, I say that with scare quotes. Who the fuck knows what that means anymore? But yeah, so reggaeton's global renaissance, it dovetailed with the advent of streaming, YouTube and Spotify being two of the most popular platforms internationally. It was so hard. It became harder for, I think, my overlords in media to deny that this, that a really important movement was happening, not just in Puerto Rico, not just in the US, but globally. And it's thanks to having streaming numbers, also having more Latinos documenting our culture across social media really helped. Having more of us on YouTube, and having, independent blogs, having projects like Gatas or like Hasta Abajo, having these independent projects really push the culture forward, is how people like me working in a mainstream news organization can also try and push the culture forward. And so I think Bad Bunny understood that his success as a mainstream artist was intertwined with our success as Latina media workers and archivists. So this is a photo from a meeting in which I basically, I worked with his team to ambush the main conference room at Rolling Stone because they wouldn't give me a cover story. And I was like, I swear to God. This man, I was like, this was like February of 2020. And I was like, y'all, this man is about to drop like the breakthrough album of the year. And they were like, maybe, I don't know. They were really like waffling about it. But it was about really like, I had to earn the trust of my editors and my bosses. But then it was also like, I had to earn the trust of the artists that I was covering. In this case, Bad Bunny. And then I also had to earn the trust of the readership, which is really hard. That's like a lot of people that when you're a journalist covering very like huge artists like this, or just anyone, it's all about earning trust. And so in this case, we ambushed the office and we played his record and people came swarming to the conference room. We couldn't fit any more people in there. And so by that point, it was really like the scene in like in the Selena movie where she's at the mall and then the lady is like, oh, you can't afford that dress. And then everyone comes flooding in when they recognize her. It was just like that. I don't think my bosses actually expected anyone in the office to recognize Bad Bunny, but they did. And so shifting the narrative. When I wrote this cover story, this is actually the most personal I ever let myself get. This is the 2020 cover story he did for Rolling Stone. I've interviewed him 7 times. And 3 of those times was for this story. And we were like sitting, chatting on Zoom. At some point, we were just like eating and talking. At many points, my abuela was coming in and she was like dusting furniture because she wanted to like eavesdrop. But I think ultimately, I approached him like, okay, this is a collaboration. I know that like he hates interviews. He really hates them, and I understand why, because I think it's really easy for things to be pulled out of context. Is that an excuse for, the ignorant things that he said or the things that he can't speak to? No. But ultimately, when I interview artists, it's like, I think the most important thing that you have to do is like treat it like a collaboration. I think that's the best way that we can, that's the best thing that we can do when we cover marginalized people in mainstream media. It's been really hard, but we got it done. But we did it, and I think, I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. Me and his ex-girlfriend, Gabriela, we were the first 2 Latinas I was the first Latina to write a cover story. She was the first Latina to photograph a cover story for Rolling Stone, and it's 50-year history at that point, or it was like over 50 years at that point. And so I think about what it took. If you really want to know what it took, you can ask me later. And off the record. But you know what? I'm really, really proud of what I did. And Jillian, I can't wait for you to ask me questions, some of which I may or may not be able to respond to them on the record. But thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nina. I'm so excited to be here, especially with this really amazing trailblazers next to me. So I'm fangirling. Okay, so I'm definitely coming from a little different perspective. I'm a curriculum writer, a curriculum specialist at the Connecticut Historical Society. A lot of my background has to do particularly with a lot of work with Puerto Rican and Black or Afro-Puerto Rican teenagers, or just youth in general, from the area of Hartford, Connecticut, or New Britain, Connecticut. So if you know anything about those spaces, you definitely know that they are spaces with high poverty rates, and not the best public school systems. So, what I've done is really for them. So as I said, I started working with youth when I literally graduated with my bachelor's degree. I went back to Wesleyan University. I was a facilitator for the Upward Bound program, and I really started working with Puerto Rican and Black high schoolers from Middletown, Connecticut, and Meriden, Connecticut. And one thing I really noticed is that there was a huge disconnect from what I wanted to teach them and what they found interesting. So what I mean by that was I had pitched to my supervisor. I was like, yo, let's do some slam poetry. And he was like, how is that going to work? Our program is predominantly like boys. And I was like, well, let me handle. I got it. I'm going to think it through. So what I did was I did hip hop history classes every Wednesday, tying it into the history of spoken word, and slam poetry, and things like that, right? But these questions kept on coming up a lot from my students. Where do I fit? Connecting to the disconnected, right? So after I did this slam poetry, it went amazing. All of them participated. There were like 85 students, and all of them did, including the boys, so that was great. And then I looked at my supervisor, and I was like, Thank you very much. But then I left, got my master's, kept on working with youth in and out. Then what really was a pivotal moment for me was working as a STEM director at the Boys and Girls Club of Hartford in a neighborhood that was predominantly Puerto Rican and Black. And I literally taught reggaeton through STEM. So I was teaching my students what reggaeton was through, okay, let's calculate beats. Let's calculate rhythms. Let's calculate this. What is a science? Oh my God, miss, really? Yeah, put on Bad Bunny. Let's count. 1, 2, 3. Oh my God, miss, we're listening to Bad Bunny? Yes, we are. We're listening to Bad Bunny today in class, right? All while teaching them the dynamics of technology, right, in reggaeton, teaching them about the dynamics of the politics in reggaeton while teaching STEM. So what I also noticed is that because Hartford is a very diverse population, and I mean that even diversity within the Puerto Rican population, so you have Puerto Ricans that were born in Hartford, right? And they've never been to the island. Then you had the Puerto Ricans that, moved stateside and they were just adjusting to Hartford, right? So you have a very different dynamic that was happening in my classroom. So what was happening was that my Puerto Rican Hartford-born kids felt more connected to hip hop than they did to reggaeton. Then my Islander-born kids felt more connected to reggaeton than they did to hip hop. So that's where I kept on getting a lot for where do I fit from both parties. Then I got from both parties, that doesn't belong to me. That's not my culture. That has nothing to do with me, right? And a lot of my brainstorming was, how do I get my students, which by the way, and if you know anything about Boys and Girls Clubs, I was serving 6-year-olds all the way to 18-year-olds, right? So I'm looking at a wide spectrum of how to teach children history, technology, science, and about reggaeton while they're having fun and listening to the artists that they know. Like Anuel, very popular in Hartford. Bad Bunny, extremely popular in Hartford. And anybody like Mickey Woods, anybody who's really hard, gangbanging hard like that, very, 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 very popular in Hartford. So I had to connect the disconnected. Okay, that was my task. So how do I do that? What I started off with all my lessons was history is a continuum. And what do I mean by that? What happened in the past is going to affect the present. And the reason why we are all here, the reason why this symposium exists is because of all those Puerto Rican activists that did the damn thing years ago that we have Centro today, right? So the fact that they did that years ago is the reason why we're here today. So that is the biggest impact that I try to teach my students, is that you're here for a reason. So getting that out the way, my approach is how to make history digestible, how to make it accessible, and how to make it fun for students in particular. So I put this picture of young Ma or young M.A., however you prefer to refer to her, and young Miko, because what I do is I preface my classes now with the history of hip hop, so then I could segue into the history of reggaeton. So now what I'm showing my students is that young M.A. that they listen to all the time influenced young Miko, who we have today. So without young M.A., we wouldn't have young Miko. And also highlighting that Black women and Black men are the ones making the way. And what does that tell my students? I'm making the way because they look like me, right? So making that connection. So again, I worked a lot with teenagers because teenagers are just the easiest population for me to work with to really talk about the themes the way I want to talk about them. So, however, so I started thinking to myself, how can I approach this where it's accessible, where it's fun, and all these things, right? And I already said history is a continuum, but now Bad Bunny throws this curveball every single week. He's throwing throwing a curveball. So now my students are coming into my room like, ay, Missy, pero tuviste lo que Bad Bunny hizo hoy? And I'm like, no vi lo que Bad Bunny hizo hoy. Vente, we got to make this thing. No, pero Missy, pon Bad Bunny, entonces pon Anuel, y yo hago el experimento, okay? And I'm like, okay, fine. So my classroom really became the reggaeton classroom, and it was great. But this is how my brain works, and this is how I felt Bad Bunny's brain was working while I was working with my students. So you have Bad Bunny, and then you have, boom, he experiments with music and fashion. He's Trap Bunny. He changes the Latin trap scene. Because of his experimentation of fashion and music, he becomes a global star. He begins heavily incorporating the diaspora. And this is important, especially to my youngsters. So when he starts incorporating the diaspora, my kids start saying, anda, that's me. That's me. So now they felt disconnected to reggaeton, and now they're connected to reggaeton. Or they felt disconnected to hip hop, and now they feel connected to hip hop. As a curriculum writer, working with young students, I just saw a major gaps of accessibility, of how we write, interpret, and deliver our histories, right? Then I noticed that they are not gonna care if it ain't impactful. You gotta give them a shebang. Even if it's just theatrics, they're kids. They're teens, right? So you have to make it interactive. So I always thought to myself, oh, man, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? And all my kids are like, oh, miss, are you on Twitter? And I'm like, yeah, girl, I'm on Twitter. And then they're like, let me follow you. I'm like, okay, cool. But then I started hearing them talking about the fact that their history teachers in schools were using Twitter in their history classes. And I was like, how interesting. Have them like live tweet things that were historical on CNN, right? Or things like that, things that were interactive that would get them thinking, but also doing things that they like doing. They like talking junk on Twitter, we all do. So what happens is I start thinking, porque yo no hago un Twitter thread, right? So I could write for my kids, right? But then I started doing a little deeper thinking, and I realized that reggaeton deserves to be studied and honored at the same level as any academic discipline. And when I started doing these Twitter threads, I made it very clear to myself that I am writing Twitter threads because they are accessible, they are digestible, they are not stuffy, they are interactive. Retweeting is interactive. You could comment on them. I have people correct me on them all the time. And it allows a flow in a conversation, and history becomes that much more interesting, right? And I always leave it clear that I do not write for those in the ivory tower. I write for my kids. Late to work and she gets news on Twitter. I write for my students who are thinking about Bad Bunny all the time, more than me. I write for my students who are just walking to the club from school and they're scrolling on their phones. And I write for my diasporic children who felt disconnected. And so I always thought, how can I help them understand history from a perspective that they could see the impact, right? So Bad Bunny becomes an entry point, right? He became an entry point for me as a curriculum writer, as an educator. And so I always was like, okay, so Bad Bunny did this today, which is a perfect example. Now I could use that in my lesson. And then I didn't have to worry about it because sometimes I could scrape my lesson because Bad Bunny did something the other day. And I was like, oh, this is perfect for the lesson. That was better than the one I already had planned. Let's scrap it, right? So this was one of my first Twitter threads that went viral. And it was me covering the Jones Act of 1917 and how it directly impacted reggaeton. So I make the case and I argue the fact that because of the migration patterns that happened after 1917, we get reggaeton. So I write for for my students, and people are feeling and people are reading, and I write for the fact that for my diasporic children to feel connected. And as a curriculum writer, I have experienced a lot of pushback for these things as well. So just a reminder que sin la diáspora no hay reggaetón.
I'm going to start us off with a question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. If there was a major theme that I heard that cut across all of your work, which is the gatekeeping that you are encountering, right? And the creative, I'm thinking especially of Susie's story, the creative ways in which you are able to go up against that. And I'm imagining, you gave us one successful story, Susie, but I'm sure all three of you can talk about also many stories that did not end that way, right? Or were perhaps a much longer struggle or an ongoing struggle. So I'm wondering if first you could maybe speak a little bit more to gatekeeping and what kinds of stories we get to see and what we don't. And I'm thinking, especially Nina too, what our students see as someone who's also an educator. And then my second question is, how does your audience fit into that? I think all of you touched on who your audience is, and that's an important piece, I think, of how I'm imagining, right? How you're able to manage, right, the difficulties of the kind of gatekeeping that you've experienced.
Hi. My entire existence. I created Reggaeton con la Gata, yes, because I'm obsessed with perreo, but also because I applied to these jobs in these different companies, and they were like, go work in hip-hop, no hay racismo en reggaeton, no hay racismo en la industria musical. The pushback has been my entire existence, even now in this space. I've worked high-profile projects, I've applied for those companies, still not able to get in the door. Know everybody, top down, still not able to get into the door. And it's like this very odd thing, because it's like, it's odd to be loved out loud, and then in the background, I can't pay my bills, And then it's like, what does that speak to, like, the magnification of my existence? The work that I'm doing is a decolonized perspective, right? It's one that a lot of people are learning from. I'm very happy to teach. It's very fulfilling. Es herencia caribeña, no? And at the same time, the repercussions, they're not always visible, and I'm not always in spaces where I'm able to even dictate that. My survival be damned, When I started tweeting back in 2017, literally I wrote this 40-page paper, started tweeting. Shout out Petra, shout out Marisol, shout out Wayne, shout out, all the academics who've done the work in that space and who have inspired me greatly, I didn't recognize at that time the magnitude of which the platform was going to be received, because essentially, what I often use as my selling point now, I'm like, this may be popular culture, but this is our heritage, Just to further answer the question, the gatekeeping, it manifests in different formats. The violence exists in different formats. Popularity oftentimes means nothing with the work that we're doing. Doesn't mean that we're good, doesn't mean that we're necessarily in positions of power necessarily, and that manifests in many different ways. I think is the best way I could speak to that.
I understand my experience is very much like the exception to the rule, and it's a really strange place to be in. I think that, I'm sure I understand. Apple Watch
Siri.
is not sure she understands.
They're listening.
Well, voy a explicarlo. Bueno, Apple Watch. No, but I mean, listen, I grew up in predominantly white institutions for my entire life, and that is how I was able to make it in music media. My father is the Spanish speaker of my parents. My mother She grew up in Belize. The national language is English. She comes from Creole culture. It's like a West Indian Anglophone culture. But I think because she was educated by, she grew up in Belize under British rule, she was such a hard ass about how I pronounce things. My dad didn't want me speaking in Spanglish, stopped speaking to me in Spanish entirely when I was a kid. I was like maybe 5 or 6, going to school, learning English. And I felt like I had every step of the way dealt with teachers. I dealt with, I dealt with bosses. I've dealt with editors who still question my grasp of the English language when I am literally like, I'm such a pocha. It's hilarious. But I've learned to embrace it because it's just how I grew up. I'm not apologizing for it, but it is context. I don't know how far I could have gotten if I wasn't light-skinned, if I wasn't born in the United States, if I had an accent. I don't know if I would have gotten this far. And so, when I grew up, I used to buy magazines. I used to read Pitchfork obsessively because I wanted to be, a great music critic. So it's like I learned the basics. I learned to be a generalist, and I still am a general music journalist. I could talk to you about Metallica. I could talk to you about the Beatles, Beach Boys, Pavement, what have you. I know a lot about rock. I know a lot about, I try to learn as much as I can about various genres. I've covered K-pop, J-rock. I've covered so many different kinds of genres because I really am like an omnivore when it comes to music at heart. But it's like knowing that it was such a struggle for me to come up in this corner of the industry is so ridiculous, given how incredibly assimilated I've been. But I also still feel I identify as a 200%er, as a third culture Latina, where I think I don't think it's as unique. I don't think my experience is that special or unique, but it is something that is shaping the conversations I'm sure that you're having with your students. I could definitely relate to their perspective of being like, where do I fit in? Is that mine? Is that not mine? I try not to approach it as okay, this belongs to me, that doesn't belong to me. I try and approach it from a place of curiosity, where I'm let me go to the source. And thankfully, because I work at, because I've written for the publications I've built relationships with publicists, where I can reach out to Bad Bunny's publicists or anyone's publicist really and be like, okay, hi, I work at an institution. Can you get me 30 minutes with this artist? That's not typical. But I try and ask them questions, a lot of the questions that you all ask, whether in academia or online or just in conversations with my friends, the stuff that comes up in that discourse, it's then, I can bring it to the artist and be like, what do you think about that? And they can either be like, I think about that a lot, or they can be like, I don't think about that at all. And then everybody gets mad about it. So it's a strange position to occupy, but what I think, having an audience, also having editors tell me who my audience is can be really frustrating. That's what I got told. In the last 10 years and change, it's I've been told by so many editors, I don't think our readership understands what that is. Can you try and translate this? Can you translate this slang or this word? And it's well, I don't know if there's a direct translation that makes sense, and having to, I know people have complained about my articles, or I'm having to over-explain things, or there might be, the explanation in English is not quite, it doesn't really resonate with people who speak Spanish because it's tricky, it's weird. So I have really tried to shift, where my audience is, but that's an internal process that happens in a publication where it's like, I got to sit down with an editor and be like, hey, I know you say that the majority of people who read the newspaper are like white and over the age of 50, but what if I told you that if I were to write more about this kind of thing, we can bring in different kinds of readership? When I don't have data for LA Times, but when I was at Rolling Stone, the Latin music section, they were able to collect data that showed that the majority of the readership for the Latin music section, when I was writing there, it was majority women who were between the ages of 25 and 35. And in contrast, the readership for like the mainstream non-Latino Rolling Stone, their readership was more in the boomer age range, and it skewed more white. So younger people were reading my articles, more women were reading my articles, and I think that the key is just, I don't know if I can say there's like one particular trick. I just, I thank God that I grew up like an anarchist, and I grew up like, I went to a lot of protests, I organized a lot of protests, and I'm glad that I could sit in these meetings where for a really long time, women like me were not allowed, women period. And I could sit there and be like, I'm gonna make you so uncomfortable right now until you give me what I want. And oftentimes that's like all it takes. Thank you.
Hello. So from my perspective, I have two different perspectives. So I have the perspective that comes from me dealing with students, right? And then also the perspective that comes from being a curriculum writer. First of all, I would like to start with, I am the only Latina in the Connecticut Historical Society that is writing curriculum. And on top of that, the only Puerto Rican, right? And what does that mean? And what does it mean to be a Puerto Rican queer woman writing Puerto Rican history? And how impactful that will be to the children to come, right? So a lot of, I don't want to say hard stops, but more of curiosity and apprehensiveness coming from the staff, right, in the Museum of Like. So I wrote a curriculum, right? My perfect example is I'm writing a curriculum. I wrote it. It's being piloted currently as we speak. And it's about bomba and tying it to reggaeton. And I am interviewing like the family, the Cepeda family, right? So like, I'm doing the whole process, but I'm tying it to Bad Bunny's Grammy presentation. And let me tell you something. That meeting when I said, I want Bad Bunny in the lesson plan, everybody was like, who is that? And I was like, well, you don't have to worry about it because the kids know. And then they're like, yeah, but we don't know. And I'm like, is the lesson plan for us or is it for the kids? So at one point, my supervisor, she was like, she looked at me like, what did I get myself into? And I'm just like, I'm here, for the kids, right? For the kids. And she's like, okay, Nina, we could try it out, right? So shout out to her for even being apprehensive, still letting me, do whatever I had to do, right? And I did it, presented it, and then at first they were like, does it really fit though? And I'm like, it does fit. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like he had people doing bomba en plena in the Grammys, and we're talking about the Cepedas, and you're telling me it doesn't fit. So like, right? So again, and I'm like, you need to trust the process, right? And I'm like, you need to trust me. And then I was like, guys, turn on your TV more. And like, right, we joke about it all the time, and all of a sudden, right, I'm in a meeting and we're doing the last review of the draft, and my committee was like, yo, we saw Bad Bunny yesterday in the MTV stuff. I was like, oh, you see, you know who Bad Bunny is, right? So then after that, there was a moment where it was pivotal. So now it was like more of like, okay, now we could see how this institution that was created in the 1800s could bring in reggaeton, right? And I'm not meant to be there. right? A person like me is not meant to write curriculum, but I'm there and I'm doing it, and I am always making sure that reggaeton is present. So that's one part. So then on the student end, right, I'm doing all these Twitter threads and stuff like that, and I have to say people on Twitter are very ruthless. They're very rude. Just very intriguing individuals, I must say. And they forget that they like to tell me, people like on Twitter like to tell me who's my audience. And I take issue with that because, like I just said, my audience is not for the people in the ivory tower. Okay, my audience is somebody completely different. And I have to say that a lot of people are upset with me, right? They are very pissed by the way I deliver history. They think that it's not academic-like, right? And I value myself as a non-traditional academic, and I take pride in that. And I say that very proudly wherever I stand. But again, those Twitter threads are not meant for people in the ivory tower. So now with that said, those same Twitter threads that people have been harassing me on or correcting me on or attacking me on via DM are the same Twitter threads that have gotten me places where I never thought, right, that I would be, like here today, and also have gotten my students places where I thought they would never be or they thought they would never be. I have a student right now who decided that he wanted to major in history, and that was because of me, right, and because of what I taught him in hip-hop history and reggaeton history. Thank you. Thinking about that and what that means and how people are not viewing history for children either. I think that's another conversation that has to be had, is that for us to be the adults that we want to be and the change makers we want to be, we have to cater to children and we have to cater to that inner child. So creating history, especially reggaeton history, things that they are so involved in and they love wholeheartedly, that they are growing up with, they need to see that that has been impactful prior to them and that it will be impactful after them. So I get a lot of pushback on Twitter for not being the traditional academic, right? And then I also get some pushback as a curriculum writer for not being the traditional academic. So I see different spectrums, but then as well the same end of the spectrums on both sides, for sure.
I wanted to say 2 questions, because I've spoken to Gata before one-on-one, I've spoken to Nina before one-on-one, and I've engaged with y'all both heavily. Like, my students read y'all, right? They love y'all. So my question for Gata, in light of like Bad Bunny conference and such, and the Coachella thing that just happened as well, the performance, right? We love it. I also noticed that Tego just dropped a song. Mm-hmm. I wonder your comments on that. Nina, I had another comment and question. Mostly, I love your threads. I think you are theorizing in the wake of like the Mundial practice of Puerto Rico in threading together and suturing diaspora. And so I wonder how you can speak a little bit more to your threads, like though they're for your students and accessible, right? Like how you see yourself stitching together diaspora. Yeah. Thank you so much for today.
So thank you so much. I'm just like so excited to see all of you, and like without your work I wouldn't be able to do my work. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the gatekeeping question that Jillian asked. And so one question is for Susie, and it's a question that I receive a lot from journalists. Now I'm going to ask you. But one of the questions I often get is that the popularity of Bad Bunny is now like there's suddenly going to be a flood of other Bad Bunnies in the mainstream media, and I'm of reggaeton, and like suddenly there's going to be Spanish language speaking artists all over the place, and I think I'm always very pessimistic about that, and so I'm just wondering, in your experience, on the other side of seeing how this sausage gets made, if you see a shift, or if it's like he's kind of a one-off, you know what I mean? And then my question for Nina, how lucky are your students to have you, right? I feel like I would have loved school, STEM, so much more if I was in your class. But one question I had, I'm from Connecticut, question, and I guess is, do you see this like passage of this law now requiring Puerto Rican studies and African American studies in secondary school? Like, has that impacted your work? Has it made it easier in any way, or it's just more of the same?
You can take any of those questions in any order.
John, so Sarah, if I'm understanding correctly, your question is on Tego's La Receta, right? Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. So I actually see you behind the scenes on that particular project, so irony. ¿Qué te digo? A lot of Tego es Tego, right? Right? And todavía people don't believe in Tego. Todavía, like, people are fighting for Tego. How stupid is that sentence? People are fighting for Tego to get, not necessarily editorial, but more so like industry support. Going back to what I was saying in that, you know, we have all these dumbass diaspora wars on Twitter, you know, like really stupid conversations on Twitter about who owns what, who made what. Al final, the public don't even know how a lot of these songs are made. Al final, the ambassadors of these songs don't mean that they wrote them, don't mean that, like, people don't see the work for hires that happen in Dominican Republic, how, like, people are paid $500 to write a song that mainstream reggaetoneros are making millions off of. And then on Twitter, we're fighting about who made the song and who owns what and what culture owns what and what nationality owns what. It's stupid. Getting back into Tego, my point is that we're at each other's throats on virtually when we ought to be coming together and getting at the real oppressor. And while the real oppressor is looking at Tego like, why are you worth my time? That's a real question that I've heard in context of that particular project. Like, Tego. So, yeah, he just dropped that song. And Tego, we all know Tego has struggled, right? He had issues with health and stuff like that. Hasn't been easy for him for reasons that are still not public that I don't feel comfortable even saying. And in which case, we ought to like get more together and support songs. You know, I'm really glad you asked that question because where I've been at mentally, especially in regards to the industry, is that a veces nosotros, like, we're our own worst enemy, like even farther of what it is that I had just said. I do how many threads on like, these are the Black Latinas in reggaeton. And then Rosalía drops a song. Then everybody's angry at Rosalía. And I'm like, why not support this thread? Why not support these artists? Why are we wasting time? You know? Sometimes we're full of shit as a culture. I'm going to say that. Like, we don't support things the way that we're supposed to. We're too busy trying to one-up each other. He'd retweet me. Que sé yo, like... And while the industry is like, mira, ellos ni se aportan, entonces yo no voy a poner mi dedo allá. Like, we waste so much of our time and our resources, and we hurt our own culture. Like, these ambassadors that are super white that we're always, like, mad about, you know why they're on? Because I really hate the word minority, but in numbers, we are smaller numbers. And instead of coming together to blast the same things that we're mad at, Rosalía taking these aesthetics from us, we're not even supporting the artists who freaking deserve it. Tego should have went viral the day he dropped that song. And instead, what we're doing? So that's the best I can answer that.
Sarah, let me answer your question. So you're asking me about like diaspora and the threading of that, right? So my biggest goal is to make sure that I can make the connection as clear as possible, right? I think that whenever people think about hip hop or people think about reggaeton, they like cut it off at one point. Like, okay, this is the history, boom, se acabó. And that's not how it is, right? So like, that's one thing that I have been working very hard on, even educating myself, right? Because even though I think that this went this far back, if I do a little bit more digging and I'm a little bit more patient, I realize that this goes this far back, right? So when it comes to threading the diaspora, it has been very controversial, for sure, especially for my Twitter. So the way that I do it is I really try to bring in a large, then more focused, than a super narrow type of view, right? So like I'll go like, okay guys, let's talk about hip hop, right? Hip hop and Bad Bunny. And then I'll go, okay, so really quick, let's skim like the history of hip hop, let's skim this, right? But I pick key points in diasporic history, right, that do show the true connections to like whatever I'm talking about, right? So like for example, one of the last threads that I made was about Mellow Man Ace, right? And the fact that Mellow Man Ace was one of the biggest precursors for people like Snow the Product, and people like Arcángel with his newest album, where he has that song, I'm blanking right now, where he's constantly switching from English to Spanish and English to Spanish, right? And he shouts out the diaspora and things like that. Like Arcángel wouldn't exist, Nicky Jam wouldn't exist. None of these people would have had existed if Mellow Man Ace didn't do that, right? So like showing those connections like that, and also trying to be open-minded with what diasporas I'm talking about and connecting a wider audience. So I try to go even outside of the Puerto Rican diaspora. So like trying to really show that it is a Black diaspora, right, that I'm reaching out to, particularly because I had a lot of African-American students and just other Black students in general that just did not feel connected or did not see the connection to what I was trying to say. They don't see why they should be impacted, or they should understand why the Jones Act impacts them. They don't see that, right? Because to them, that has nothing to do with them. And my job has been showing them that, yes, it does have something to do with you, right? So this influx of people now change the demographics of your hood, right? And now your hood is different than it was prior to this event that happened. And then now you have this mixture of people in one place that now gives birth to a genre of music, right? So like things like that, so they could really start shaping. So what I really have to say is also to that point is, man, a lot of pushback from people outside of the diaspora. So I get a lot of pushback from Puerto Rican Islanders, for sure. Y yo soy isleña myself, but I do get a lot of pushback where they feel like, why are you connecting that? Leave that out. Don't connect that. That has nothing to do with this. Leave it out. And it's just, or why is that connected to me si eso es música negra? Eso es música no de nosotras, ¿verdad? And trying to show you que esa música negra sí es parte de nuestra historia, es parte de our lineage, es parte de por qué tú puedes escuchar a J Balvin, por qué tú puedes escuchar a Daddy Yankee, right? So like really showing that like, and also centering Blackness is a very big part of my diasporic work with these threads and stuff like that. I hope I answered your question. It was very all over the place because that's just how my brain is working right now. So I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
That's good.
I think like on that note, you know, Petra, like what you asked about who's the next Bad Bunny. It's so funny because that's what my job has become, is like scouting for the next Bad Bunny, but it's so removed from his artistry. It's so removed from anyone's artistry. It's all like, it's completely just rooted in commercial interests. He is, you know, he's an anomaly. He was never supposed to happen. Somebody like Bad Bunny doing songs like, you know, Hablamos Mañana, you know, or doing Neverita. Like when he goes on his little like side quests, I love that. You know, okay, I feel like being a raver today. Like that's fun. Okay, I feel like being emo. That's really fun for me. But it's like, he was not supposed to happen because he is such an unpredictable artist. I mean, you were talking about your students bringing in something new that he did every day. I swear to God, like this man releasing last minute albums constantly, ruining my life. It was literally Nochebuena when he dropped Por Siempre, and I was like supposed to be helping my abuela get ready for Christmas, but no, I had to be writing an album review. Suddenly I was like on the balcony like da 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 da, and then everyone's like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be making this. And I'm like, I am a career woman. Oh, okay, she's a career woman. You know, like that's how that conversation usually goes. But yeah, oh my God, talk about dropping bombs on me all the time. Oh, great, it's midnight on a Thursday, and I should be singing karaoke with my friends, but instead I got to be writing. The review for Yo Hago Lo Que Me Da La Gana, I was in jury duty in Brooklyn. Okay, I snuck my phone in past security so I could write that album review for Rolling Stone, because that's how he is. So I didn't get an advanced listen of that album, so that's just, but anyway, Bad Bunny was never supposed to happen in the American music, in the US music industry. He was never supposed to happen. So when people are like, who's the next Bad Bunny? I'm like, I don't think there's gonna be another Bad Bunny. I think that what he's really good at doing, and it's what I try to do, you know, I try to connect people. And I think that what he's really good at doing is bringing in people from throughout the diaspora, throughout like Puerto Rican diaspora, like bringing, bringing like Viana on stage or something. Like that's really important. Bringing young Miko on stage is so important. Introducing non-Dominicans or non-Caribbeans to El Alfa, you know, was so important. And so I think I would like to see more of that happen in the music industry. I try and cover, as many indie artists as I can. But it's like, you know, the constraints, the commercial constraints of media do make that job a little harder for me, which is why I think everyone should also, you know, I mean, it's like I get a lot of access, but it's also important to like support people, you know, like Nina, like Gata, who can say the things that my editors won't always let me get away with. But yeah, I think that what's happening is we are seeing a renaissance. I think there is definitely like an influx of reggaeton and trap artists coming from Latin America. I mean, look at what's happening in regional Mexican music right now. They grew up listening to hip hop, they grew up listening to trap, and they're doing something cool and inventive with it. And I think that, you know, again, speaking of like third culture Latinas, that is the future. And so instead of like, I always tell people, I'm like, there may never be another Bad Bunny, but there will be a lot of creative people coming up in this generation and the next generation and the next generation. And we have to keep our ears open to that.
Okay.
Can I really quickly? Sorry,
very quickly, because we've run out of time, but quick.
I love what you said. And also, I'm just always on the cautionary side, because part of the other reason why we will never have another Bad Bunny is because, yes, he was never supposed to happen. And also, we love one racehorse in the Latin side. Oh my God.
It's dangerous, isn't it?
We love one racehorse. Let him mess up. Todo el mundo, he went from Benito to Ben, right? Right? For some people, for me, I don't get it. Like
Jennifer Lopez Affleck.
He's always liked Blanquita, so I don't get the whole thing. But in which case, it's like, what? So when he stumbles, what's gonna happen? I don't get why we do that in Latin. In Anglo, they would never. We have Drake, we have Wiz Khalifa, we have so many rappers, my brain hurts. ¿Me entiende? To mention that once. We like to pretend like we're supporting multiple artists at the same time, at the same height. Don't know why we like racehorses, but we do. That's the like legacy of Latin.
It's anti-artist too.
It's very
to put
anti-artist.
all your money behind one artist, like.
Digo yo que the Latin music industry is Latinidad in a structure that's able to be viewed for the entire world. Like our little like sayings become trademarks, become things that they monetize off of, that they feed to us, that we then, it's like a cycle, ¿me entiende? So like in which case, like I'm just trying to be like on the cautionary side, because I'm just like, we sometimes have too much faith. We have too much faith in the idea that this institution is going to give us these things. That's why I'm really trying to stress, like, he was never supposed to happen. And on top of that, they don't even know what to do with him. Like, he's, doing all of these things in regards to misogyny, machismo. These are all things that have existed in our culture forever. And now it's being addressed. They don't know what to do with him. Era una bomba, to be honest. Are we gonna have another one of him? I think we get exciting moments like Fade and etc. But like, a ese nivel, we are so hell-bent on maintaining certain levels of white supremacy. We are so hell-bent on not unlearning. And until that becomes a culture, like, we're gonna continue having these racehorses, I feel. Like, we need to be very conscious of that, of how the industry just don't really support culture. They sell the idea of supporting culture. You see.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.